Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Mohammed Shafiq. I'm the chair of the PCS Union National Black Members Committee. Welcome to our Holocaust Memorial Day 2025 session here exclusively on our various social media platforms, wherever you are around the country. A very warm welcome. I'm your host for the evening. Really honoured that we are able to put this event for the very first time as a national event, and really powerful speakers that we have. So if you're watching this, please do share the link with your friends and your colleagues, and then we'll be able to hear from our very guest speakers. The theme this year was for a better future. It's also the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, Birkenau, the largest Nazi concentration camp, and it's also the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Bosnia. And so 80 years on, obviously yesterday was a national commemoration, and obviously we have seen an increased level of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, not just here in the UK, but around the world. And obviously there are people who are trying to exploit that. Really proud that PCS Union has always stood against racism in all its forms, whether that's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. We stand united together on many platforms on these issues, and we are led by two powerful leaders in our movement, obviously our General Secretary, Fran Heathcote, and also our National President, Martin Kavanagh. We'll be hearing from him very, very shortly this evening. I'm really, really honoured and really moved that we have some powerful speakers to be joining us. And I'm just waiting for my first speaker to get the go-ahead. But whilst we do that, you know, there are many things that we can all do. Many years ago in my day job, I had the unique honour of organising the very first Holocaust Memorial Day in a mainstream government department. And when you hear the testimony from survivors, it really does move you, whether that's from the Holocaust, from the Bosnian genocide, Rwanda, and also making sure that we learn the lessons so that we can apply that in current society, but in future conflicts as well, so that we understand where we got to and how we got to this point. And one of the things that you look back to the Holocaust, it didn't start just with the extermination of the Jewish people in the Holocaust and members of the LGBT plus community, disabled people, Roma, trade unionists. It started with hateful rhetoric that was used against that community, which made them more vulnerable, and obviously was the beginning of the journey towards the horrific actions in the Holocaust. And so that's what we're going to do. We've got four powerful speakers. Let me introduce them to you. They've got powerful presentations. We have Smajo Bejo, who is the founder of the Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust. He'll be speaking very, very shortly. And then we also have Saoirse Amithia Tweedale. She's chair of PCS Proud, which is the LGBT plus committee for PCS Union. She'll be talking about the LGBT plus community that also were killed during the Holocaust. And then we're joined by our national president, Martin Kavanagh, and we'll finish off with Julia Burton, who is a member of the 45A Charity Society, and she's going to be talking about her family connection to the Holocaust as well. So, and then we'll have some comments and questions, which a lot of you have submitted in advance. I'm hoping at this point I should be able to say our first speaker is ready. If you can just tell me in the chat that's ready, and we can chat. As I said, introduce to you. Here we are. He appears on my screen. Smajo, a very warm welcome. As I said, from Bosnia, doing some amazing work in the community. Had the great privilege of hearing his presentation at our very first commemoration event we had in the government department that I used to organise. So, Smajo, great to see you, my friend. Thank you so much for honoring us. Obviously, the 30th anniversary of the start of the Bosnian genocide and war as well. Smajo, over to you, my friend.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Just to double check. Yeah, you're nodding. Perfect. My slideshow doesn't work, but it doesn't matter. I don't want to hold anyone up any longer, so I'm just going to go with this. Yes, as already been mentioned, it's the 30th anniversary of the Bosnian genocide, so I'll tell you a bit about my family experience, a bit about the Bosnian War and how we came to the UK. Now, I haven't got time to talk about everything that happened to my family and everything that happened in Bosnia, but I do want to reflect on this year's theme for a better future through two life-defining moments, one from here in the UK and the other one from Bosnia. I was involved with the national ceremony yesterday in London, and I've spoken in various events across the country alongside Holocaust survivors, and many of them who I call, close and personal friends now, like Martin Stern, who I've learned so much from about life, about humanity, about peace. So yeah, I'm incredibly privileged to be here this evening. So thank you so much for that opportunity. So it's the 30th anniversary, as I've mentioned. The genocide in Bosnia, it's often simplified or reduced to a town called Srebrenica in July of 1995, where more than 8,372 Bosniak, predominantly men and boys, were murdered in just a couple of days. However, what happened in Srebrenica was just a culmination of atrocities that happened across Bosnia, starting as early as 1992. So before the war in Bosnia, Bosnia was a normal, modern European country. We had everything that we have here in the UK. My family is Muslim, but we also had Catholics, we had Orthodox Christians, we had atheists, of course. And that was completely normal for my family. And I think it was normal for a lot of families in Bosnia. The only difference between us kids was which football club we supported, which cartoon we watched, which book we like to read. A year before I was born, in 1984, Bosnia actually hosted the Winter Olympics, and some of you might remember Torval and Dean becoming the highest scoring figure skaters of all time and household names, and I think they're still around. Maybe they actually retired last year. But then 7 years later, the siege of Sarajevo began. And the siege of Sarajevo is still considered to be the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare. So just 7 years on from the Olympics. We often hear perpetrators of genocide and awful things like this described as monsters, because you expect mass murder and rape to be perpetrated by monsters and by strangers. You don't expect normal people to be able to do these things. You imagine unknown soldiers coming into your town, maybe speaking a different language, wearing a uniform covered in unfamiliar symbols, or carrying a flag of a foreign country, because it's easier to imagine that than to imagine your next door neighbor, your friend, in some cases, even your family member, wanting to suddenly kill you just because of who you happen to be, because of your identity, because of your name, because the only thing that differentiated us in Bosnia was our faith. But what I think is always important to remember is that majority of these perpetrators before the war were ordinary, good, normal people, just like all of us here. But somehow they accepted an ideology that led them to doing the most awful and inhumane things to their friends, to their neighbors, and, as I said, in some cases, to their families. So how was this possible? And does that mean under the right circumstances, we're all persuadable? And one of my earliest memories of feeling that something wasn't right in Bosnia was one day I ran into the house, and we lived in the countryside. We had just moved into our new home that my parents had designed and built. And I saw my mom was sitting in front of the TV and she was crying. And I stopped, and no one wants to see their parent upset. And I ran to her, and she hugged me and she kissed me on the head, just like she always did. And she said it was nothing, go outside and play. And again, I was, listening to my parents. I was relatively a good child at that time. I went outside, and I always remembered she was watching protests and speeches or something like that on TV. And it was only years later that I realized my mom was watching news reports of war spreading across parts of Croatia, neighboring Croatia, parts of northern Bosnia. And she knew sooner or later they would come to us. She knew she was completely helpless. Before this, My parents had an opportunity to move to Paris. My dad's brother, my uncle, lived in Paris. Him and his wife, my auntie, they made clothes for some famous fashion designer. I never knew who it was. And they were always asking us to come. But we had this amazing life in Bosnia and we didn't want to leave. Then in the spring of 1992, so about 6 or 7 months after we had just moved into our new home, I was 7 years old. Our village, our town was surrounded by the Yugoslav National Army. So imagine where you are now being surrounded by the British Army, the army that's there to protect you. But in reality, the Yugoslav National Army was already under the control of Serbian nationalists. And some of you might have remembered Slobodan Milosevic. So Bosnia was one of the constituent republics of Yugoslavia. For us kids, this felt completely abrupt and overnight, but in reality there was this steady rise of the humanization of Bosniak Muslims, as well as minorities, Roma and others across the former Yugoslavia. But in reality, my parents again tried to shield me and my siblings from this reality, from what was happening around us. And at first it was surreal because these were friends and neighbors still coming for tea and coffee every single day. But now they were carrying guns and wearing uniforms, and me and my brother were fascinated with soldiers. You know, it was the things that we saw on TV and films. But then things quickly changed. We started hearing rumors of concentration camps and torture. A Serbian friend who had come and gave me and my brother sweets and chocolate every single day. One day he came and he was ranting about Muslims doing something somewhere. And as I ran to him, he pushed me, I fell back. He got his knife out, he started sharpening it, and he said today was a good day for cutting throats. And I just remember thinking, what has this got to do with me? I started crying because I said, you know, although my family was Muslim, Christmas and Easter were a completely normal part of my childhood. And childhood was amazing because we celebrated those things together. We were lucky that day we had another Serbian friend that was nearby and he saved us. And there were several occasions like that in the early start of the war where we had Serbian friends that risked their lives to save us. Another day, my dad's cousin was taken. No one knows really what happened. We suspect he was beaten. He was brought back home and he passed away. A few days after that, my dad took me to the hospital. On the way back, there was a roadblock set up into our village. And my dad was told, you're not going back. You're going into the camp that was set up on the outskirts. And again, we were lucky. We had another Serbian friend that was nearby and he saved us. And as I said, there was many occasions like this early on in the war where people risked their lives to save us. Around this time, this was about spring of 1992, in other parts of Bosnia, eastern parts of Bosnia, there was already mass killings and mass atrocities being committed. So it was becoming unsafer for us to be there. A lot of families had already escaped before the Yugoslav National Army came, but my parents decided to stay together. And one day, shelling was getting more intense and the house searches were becoming more frequent. My parents decided that we had to escape as well, and we escaped through the mountains. In the first 9 months of war, we moved 14 times. We didn't know where we were going or what we would find, but we had to simply move just to survive. We eventually settled on the outskirts of my hometown with my uncle, my dad's brother. And we lived as refugees for about a year, but at least we were still in one place. Life was difficult. All the things that we just take for granted now, they were completely gone. About a year into the war, in the summer of 1993, things started changing again. And maybe because I was older, I started noticing things. But again, my parents are shielding us. One day we were all photographed, and I remember thinking, what is this? And I asked my mom, and my mom said, and I've still got those photographs. It's a shame I can't show you the slideshow because I've still got the photographs. And my mom said, don't worry, it's nothing. We're getting our photographs taken so we can go and leave, so we can go to Paris, so we can go to France. But in reality, what was happening this time, a year into the war, the Croatian army started creating an inventory of all Bosniak Muslims living in that area. So we were all documented, and we were all photographed. We were given an identity number. Again, my parents were shielding me, and I didn't understand this until a lot later. One day, we were playing outside, me, my brother and sister and our friends, and we saw trucks leaving the center of town. Again, naively, little boys thinking soldiers going on a mission, something exciting is happening. We run to the road, we're excited. You know, my friend sees his uncle and we're waving. My sister sees my dad and I pretend I see him, but I don't think I actually saw him. And then my sister's mood quickly changes. She starts rushing us home. My sister was older. My sister was 13, and she figured out what was happening. This time, the Croatian or Bosnian Croats, with the support of Croatia, started rounding up all Bosniak Muslim men and boys in my hometown. So all the men of fighting age, but also a lot of elderly. I think the oldest person that was taken was 90, and the youngest was 13. Some of my cousins were 16, taken into camps that were set up throughout the town and the region. Schools, hospitals were converted into concentration camps. There was camps for women and children. Some of my family members were kept in concentration camps, you know, kids my age, so about 7, 8 years old at the time. But we were one of the lucky families, and we were allowed to remain in my uncle's home. The next day, Croatian soldiers came to take my uncle that we were staying with. And I remember as the soldiers approached, we just wrapped ourselves around my uncle. We hung on to him. My sister kept saying, "You've taken my dad, please don't take my uncle. You've taken my dad, please don't take my uncle. You've taken my dad, please don't take my uncle." And he was just gone. So literally all of my male family members were gone. And we remained behind for about a month or so. And literally all of our Croatian neighbors forgot us overnight. The only sympathy, I always make this point, that we got in that month was from animals. We had a dog called Leslie that me and my brother were obsessed with. And then about a month, so in August of 1993, so about a month after my dad was taken away, soldiers came and threw all of us out of our home, and we were to be taken to a so-called collection center, which was set up in the factory where my dad actually had worked just before the war. We got there was, you know, hundreds of people there, thousands of people there, panicking and screaming, and we were taken in one family at a time into one of the office rooms, and we were searched. My mom was forced to sign this document to say that she was giving up everything that we had to the local council for safekeeping. And I've actually found that document. I work at Newcastle University and I do research on this. And I actually found that very document that my mom was forced to sign in 1993. And you can see her signature. She's number 13 on this list. We were searched by Croatian soldiers that we knew. One of them, my mom was really, really good friends with, a childhood friend. One of them tried to bribe me. He said, "If you show me where your mom is hiding her money, I'll buy you a massive chocolate bar." And I remember seeing myself crying in the reflection of his sunglasses. My sister begged these soldiers to let her keep her earrings that were given to her by my granddad just before he passed away, but they took everything. We were then put onto trucks, driven towards Bosnian government-controlled territory. And again, we were just told, you're marching in one direction. We didn't know where we were going or what we would find, but I'll always remember this day. You know, there's belongings scattered by the side of the road everywhere. There's elderly unable to keep walking, sitting by the side of the road. There's dead bodies. I had never seen a dead body before. And we always had the same routine. I would be on the left, my brother would be on the right, and my sister would be, my mom would be in the middle holding I would be on the left, my brother on the right, and my sister just ahead of us. And I remember I stepped over what I thought was a pile of clothes and a foam mattress on top of it. And as I stepped over it, I looked to the side and I felt something firm underneath my feet. I felt something different. And as I looked to the side, I saw it was a body of an old man. And I remember thinking in that moment, is my granddad lying by the side of the road somewhere? Or has he been taken to a camp? Or has he got the energy to keep moving? So after weeks of wandering around, exhausted and starving, after sleeping in ruins and escaping over dead bodies on several times, we made our way to a town called Mostar in southern Bosnia, and my Auntie Amina's house. And Mostar, again, it's a shame that I can't show you the slideshow, but Mostar is famous for an old Ottoman bridge, which some of you might have heard of. If you haven't Googled it, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And I remember the night when we arrived at her door, We were exhausted and starving and frightened, but I felt this instant relief being there. She was always my favorite auntie. She was always joking around. She just had this amazing confidence about her. She had this huge wavy hair, which I was always fascinated by. And nearly all of my memories of her are of her smiling, even during the most difficult and the hardest moments of the war. In reality, life in Mostar was incredibly difficult. We were surrounded on one side by the Croatian army and on the other side by the Serbian army. If you want to understand what Mostar was like, or the siege of Mostar, a BBC journalist, British journalist called Jeremy Bowen, which some of you might have heard of, did an incredible report called Unfinished Business. It's still on YouTube. You can watch it. And it was actually submitted as evidence at The Hague against several Croatian politicians and generals. I think on around 100,000 shells fell onto Mostar. More than 80% of the city centre was destroyed. Some days we would eat once. Most days, we fell asleep hungry. But in reality, we were there. We were all together. My auntie Amina just gave us this sense of safety being there. My grandparents did manage to make their way there. But my auntie Amina and my mom were so creative in how they kept us alive. They used chicken feed to make bread. They used grass to make pies. The chicken feed, it's like crushed Weetabix. That's what it looks like. But it made the most awful brown bread. It doesn't taste anything like Weetabix. 30 years later, I still can't eat Weetabix now. Grass to make the most disgusting pies, but they kept us going. And although we were living in these awful conditions, my auntie Amina just gave us this sense of normality and safety. And no matter how difficult life got, we didn't give up on the things that we valued. If anything, we held on to them even more. And my auntie Amina and my mom always reminded us of those values. So by January of 1994, we started school, really as an act of defiance. You're over there trying to kill us, and we're here trying to, learn and be kids. So we went to school at night because it was too dangerous to go during the day. And I was desperate to learn to read and write because we started receiving letters through the International Red Cross from my dad. And I have several letters that I could have shown from this period. So we were desperate to go to school, but also just to be around other kids, to be normal. Just apart from the bombs and starvation, it was incredibly, boring just being inside the house constantly. My last night of school was actually on the 24th of January, 1994. And that night, the Croatian army used a plane to drop improvised bombs onto Mostar. And through my classroom window, I could see our whole street up in flames. As you can imagine, a classroom full of 8-year-olds, there was panic and screaming and candles flying around everywhere. But I was just frozen in shock. I don't remember crying or screaming. I just kept looking back up at the house because I knew everyone that I loved, everyone that I knew was still alive, was back up at the house. My auntie Amina, she was standing at the front door of the house. The blast, she was wounded across the stomach and the blast threw her back into the house. My grandparents, my auntie's kids, and my sister put her on a blanket. They carried her out of the house. Neighbors rushed out to help. They got her into a car. Petrol was almost impossible to come by because of the siege, as well as the international sanctions. So they just pushed and pushed. They got her to the main road into another car, which had a bit more petrol, and they drove frantically in the dark with, bullets and bombs and shells falling around them. That car runs out of petrol as well, and they just had to push and push, and they managed to get her to the hospital. It was a makeshift hospital. It wasn't the pre-war hospital. It didn't have any medicine. It didn't have any medical equipment, but at least it had doctors. And again, if you watch that Jeremy Bowen documentary, he actually visits that hospital when he's there. One of the doctors that was actually treating her was my mom's first cousin. She had lost so much blood before she even got to the hospital, and she hung on. She was strong, and the doctors tried everything to save her. And I think about the pain that she must have gone through, because there was nothing that they could give her to ease her the pain. But she was so strong, and she hung on. And unfortunately, she passed away at 4 a.m. the next morning on the 25th of January. Although we had experienced awful things by this point of the war. This was a defining moment. When she was killed, it felt helpless. It felt like a part of each of us was gone, because no one ever thought something like this could happen to her. Just because of how strong she was, how fearless she was, and she helped us to get through the war because she could see the future. And not in the sense of a fortune teller who sees the future as it will be. She had a clear vision of the future as it should be, and there's a huge difference there. She knew what her values were and what kind of world she wanted to live in after the war. A world where her kids could go to school, be safe, not consumed with hatred and anger. I was 8 years old at the time, and in that moment, if I'm being completely honest, I lost faith in humanity. I don't think I believed that there was any humanity or good left in this world. I mean, how could there be when we were being hunted and slaughtered in this way? In moments of emotional distress, your mind will latch onto any construct that will make it feel better. We were in shock. The winter of 1994 was brutal. It was bitterly cold. We were starving. We burned pretty much everything that we had in the house. I have a lot of books. I'm obsessed with books. We burned every book that we had. We started burning furniture. We were starving. As I mentioned, life was incredibly fragile and meaningless, as if any of us could be next. And if I'm being honest, a small part of me wasn't even afraid of being next. My biggest fear was being left behind. So we were hurting and we all wanted to feel better. And in that desperation, we were vulnerable and susceptible to hatred, to anger, extremism, and false beliefs. The easiest and the most soothing and emotionally satisfying thing for my mom to do in that moment. She's just lost her sister. Her kids are starving. She hasn't seen her husband, her brother, and most other male relatives for months. Would have been to tell us to direct all of our anger and all of our pain towards all creation people, towards all Catholics even, and all Christians, to tell us that they're all the same and all equally responsible, to tell us that they're all murderers and rapists and liars. She could have protected her pain with a shield of anger and aggression. And I think that's what most people would have done in that situation. But my mom did something different. She realized what impact this would have on us. So she sat me, my brother and sister down on the very day that her sister was killed. She carefully explained that we can't live our lives consumed by hate. She told us that there are good and bad people in this world, that we're all individuals. And the best way to resist those that were killing us was not to become hateful like them. For me, this remains one of the most amazing examples of someone choosing compassion over hatred. Of course, it wasn't just one conversation. This was only the beginning, but we all have the power to choose how we react to any given situation in life. And that's the one thing that no matter what, no one can take away from us. So we moved out of my Auntie Amina's house. It was just too difficult for my mom and my grandparents to stay there. We just occupied a ruin that we found. We fixed it up the best that we could. Then around June of 1994, the British Red Cross tracked us down in Mostar. And on the 19th of June, 1994, the British Red Cross came to take us out of Mostar, and we were brought here as part of something called the Bosnia program, or the Bosnia project, which is what I'm doing research on at the moment. So my dad was taken out of a concentration camp when his camp was discovered by British journalists. Actually, 500 men, those in the worst condition, that was tortured, beaten, they were brought out, and my dad was brought to the UK on the 19th of January 1994. We left Bosnia on the 19th of June 1994, and we arrived in Newcastle on the 19th of July 1994. And again, I've got my dad's plane ticket that I usually show in my slideshows. The process of recovery was a long one for us, and in reality it's still ongoing, but it was only possible with the help of other people. And that brings me to my second defining moment. After everything that we experienced in Bosnia, what we wanted more than anything was people to see us as human beings, to see that we had a history, that we had dreams, that we had relationships and hopes for the future, just like everyone else. And I can honestly say we met some of the most amazing and compassionate people here. I have letters from March and April of 1994 from the MP of Newcastle at the time, Jim Cousins, where he describes my family as his constituents when writing to the British government, the Croatian government, the Bosnian government, trying to locate us. In April of 1994, we were still in Mostar, living under siege. Starving. My auntie Amina had died. We were still processing her murder. And there was someone here in Newcastle, in the UK, describing me as their constituent. And I didn't even know where Newcastle or the UK was, if I'm being honest, at that time. When we finally arrived, we had incredible and amazing volunteers that took us on trips. We had amazing teachers that helped us learn English and do homework. People opened up their homes for us. Next to our refugee centre in Newcastle lived a couple called Christina and John. They literally opened their home up for us. They held parties. So many incredible examples of kindness like this. So I was 9 years old at the time, and I started school in year 5 without knowing a word of English. My teacher was amazing. Her name was Miss Webster, but I didn't understand a word she was saying. She had this thing where at the end of each day, we'd all sit around her on the floor. She'd play the guitar, we'd sing this song, and I couldn't understand what they were singing, but I could see she'd sing one part of the song. Then she'd say someone else's name, or she would point to someone, and the next part of the song would be sang with that person's name in it, and they'd get to go home first. So naturally, my classmates loved this. I hated it. It annoyed me because I couldn't understand what they were singing. But if I'm being honest, it annoyed me mainly because of how happy they all were. I was having awful nightmares at the time. I miss my grandparents. I miss my family. I miss my friends in Bosnia. I wanted to run away. So I eventually started having separate English lessons. One day I come back into the classroom. We sit down. Everyone is extra excited this day. They're all looking at me more than usual. Of course, I'm thinking it's because I can't speak English, because I'm different, because I'm a refugee, because they can't say my name right. They call me Smajo, Smaho. They never call me Smayo. Miss Webster starts playing the guitar. They all start singing. But this time I did understand. And not because I could miraculously understand English all of a sudden. It was because they were singing in Bosnian for me. So while I was having separate English lessons, Miss Webster taught our entire class how to sing this song for me in Bosnian, just to make me feel welcome. And this was the first day I went home with a smile on my face. And this moment was special. And I don't think they realized it then, but they made me feel like I belonged and that I was home. I think my time is up. So thank you so much for listening.
Well, Smajo, thank you so much. Really powerful testimony there. And you've got a tinge of Geordie accent as well. So you must be doing something right. Thank you so much. I know you're going to be staying with us because we'll have some questions that people have submitted in advance as well, and solidarity messages from across the union. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Really honoured that Sir Shamita Tweedale, who's the chair of PCS Proud, is here. We did advertise Claire Manulli from the TUC LGBT plus community, but she's been taken ill, so solidarity and best wishes to her. But Saoirse, thank you so much for stepping in to talk about some of the LGBT plus victims, because they were some of the very first of the victims of the Holocaust. Over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. As Mohammed has said, I've stepped in at the last minute, so please forgive me if this is a little disjointed. I'm also going to look more at this issue, rather than talk about personal stories, something that the first speaker touched on, where friends, relatives, neighbours turn on minorities. What can lead to that? How does that happen? What happened in the Weimar Republic and Nazi Germany? But also, why do we have such difficulty articulating the LGBT plus victims of the Holocaust? And in a way, I'm going to start at the end of this discussion. It was only in 2008 in the Tiergarten Park in central Berlin that a memorial was put up to the LGBT victims of the Holocaust. One of the reasons we have difficulty understanding and knowing the stories of the LGBT plus victims is actually a result of the situation, not just in Germany, in the 1930s, 40s, and afterwards, but in Europe and most of the world, where homosexuality was illegal. Of all the prisoner groups that went to the concentration camps and into the prison system, the penal system in Nazi Germany, after the war, the LGBT plus victims had to still serve out their sentences. Not only that, as people were coming to terms with what had happened to them and telling their stories and making the world aware of the atrocities that had gone on, the LGBT plus community couldn't. They couldn't speak, because to speak out and say they were a victim because of their sexuality or gender identity could have landed them in prison in their own country. When you look at Germany itself, it was split in 1949 into East and West Germany. One thing I'm going to talk about is paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code from 1871. Might seem like a history lesson, but that's crucial to understanding to what happened to the LGBT community in the Weimar Republic. Now, both East and West Germany kept that paragraph 175 after the war. In East Germany, they used the original 1871 definition, which was fairly tight. And in 1957, they kind of stopped enforcing it. However, in West Germany, in contrast, they used the 1935 Nazi revision of it. And between 1949 and 1969, over 59,000 West German men were convicted of homosexual acts. It was only in 1994, with the German reunification, that homosexuality ceased to be illegal in Germany. So by then, a lot of the first-hand experiences of the LGBT community in the Holocaust were lost to us. And it's now an area of academic research trying to recover those lives, trying to recover what happened, trying to recover the victims. It's also complicated, especially when you look at lesbians that were persecuted, because Nazi ideology was very specific in the 1935 revision of the paragraph 175. Nazi ideologists argued about whether or not lesbians should be included under the provisions, and they concluded not. I'll probably come on to explain that a little later, but one of the reasons why they concluded not was it was their view that good Aryan lesbian women could either be persuaded to bear children or forced to bear children, and therefore should not be imprisoned because of their lesbian acts. That doesn't mean to say lesbians didn't end up in death camps or concentration camps. They absolutely did. Just to get you a couple of names there on that, which it kind of signals the example about what we were talking about, friends getting you arrested. Ellis Muller and Marguerite Rosenberg, they were denounced by their co-workers and accused of interfering with women's work duties. And they were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, but they were sent, like many lesbians, as political prisoners. They didn't have the pink triangle that the gay men did. They were sent as political prisoners. However, we know that the two of them were a lesbian couple because on the records, the prison records, somebody wrote above it, lesbian, just the word lesbian. But actually covering the number of lesbians that actually went to prison, went to the concentration camps, is exceedingly difficult unless, like those two, there's a note on the file that says it. But what I want to do is to take you back a little bit to the start of the story. Weimar Germany in the 1920s was in many ways the capital of the world for LGBT rights, especially Berlin. There was clubs, there was theatres, there was cabaret, there were drag acts. It was the base of Magnus Hirschfeld's Centre of Sexology. Some of you might have heard of that. In fact, In 1929, Magnus Hirschfeld had been pioneering the decriminalisation of homosexuality, and he had got the support of some notable German parties, amongst them the German League for Human Rights, the German Democratic Party, the Socialist Democratic Party, and the Communist Party. Opposed to them, however, were right-wing parties, including the Nazis, and mainstream religious groups. They debated in 1929 whether to decriminalise it, and obviously it didn't work. But going back a couple of years, William Frick, who was a Nazi Reichstag member, said, "Men committing unnatural sexual acts with men must be persecuted with utmost severity. Such vices will lead to the disintegration of the German people." And again in 1928, Nazi party propaganda to a questionnaire on paragraph 175 during that debate said, "Anyone who even thinks of homosexual love is our enemy." Hitler and the Nazis came to power 30th of January 1933. By May 6th, 1933, the SA and the Nazi students ransacked the Centre of Sexology, absolutely trashing the place. The woman who first had lower surgery, Dora Richter, was working there. She disappears from history after that attack. We don't know what happened to her. But what they did, you might have seen the famous book burning pictures with a pile of books with an SA officer throwing and mistakenly people think that's from May the 10th when the libraries were attacked and Jewish literature was burned. It isn't. That picture's from May the 6th when they burnt the research notes, setting back the treatment of trans and LGBT plus people by decades by burning that. But they kept the lists of the patients and they were used later by the police for arrests. So, as Mohammed said, the LGBT community was one of the first targets of the Nazi regime. But why? Well, the Nazis promoted a traditional family values with distinct gender roles for men and women and encouraged women to have children. Gay people, therefore, were regarded as a threat to those ideals. But when the Nazis rewrote paragraph 175 in 1935 of the Penal Code, they took out the word unnatural because that was actually being used to say, well, is that act unnatural or not? And people were being fined rather than imprisoned. So they broadened the definition and made it easier for gay men to be arrested or sentenced. Just to give you some idea of the effect of that law, in 1934, 948 men were convicted under paragraph 175. In 1936, that went up to 5,320. By 1938, that was over 8,500. At its peak, there was almost 600 a week arrested. Now, most of them went into the penal system, the Kerpo, led by the criminal police, but they worked very closely with the Gestapo, the political police. However, those who reoffended or were regarded as the potential for reoffended, they were sent to the concentration camps. And as far as we know, that was somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 men were sent to the concentration camps. Going back a little bit, though, I've mentioned the SA, but most of you will know the Schutzstaffel or SS. Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, in 1936 established the Reich Central Office for the combating of homosexuality and abortion. Note that, homosexuality and abortion. We talk now about the links between the anti-LGBT movement, and particularly anti-trans movement, and female reproductive rights. It's there. It's there in 1936 when Himmler was set up that organization. Remember what I said, very strict gender roles. The Nazis awarded medals for German women who bore children and even encouraged women to bear children out of marriage because they wanted to strengthen the Aryan race. So obviously with that ideology, abortion was absolutely not permitted. In 1937, Himmler, again, in a speech to SS leaders, said that the persecution and even murder of homosexuals was desirable because gay people hindered efforts to breed a dominant, racially strong nation. Quote, all things which take place in the sexual sphere are not the private affair of the individual, but signify the life and death of the nation. A people of good race, which has too few children, have a one-way ticket to the grave. Now, we say that history doesn't repeat itself, and that's right, it doesn't, but it certainly echoes. And that speech by Himmler that I just quoted you resonates today with some things that are happening around the world. And we need to be careful of this kind of ideology. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just quickly move to what I'd said. I wasn't going to name people, but I wanted to give you an example. This is Lydie Barcroft. In last year, the German High Court had to rule that trans people were victims of the Holocaust, and that to deny that is Holocaust denial. Lydie Barcroft, I'll just read this. You might not know what a Stolperstein, my German is terrible, Stolperstein is, but if you go to Germany, you'll notice little brass plates in the roads in most German cities. They commemorate the people who were murdered in the death camps, and it'll have their name and their dates of birth and where they were born, including their street. Now, Lydie's is very specific. It's in Hamburg. It gives her dead name and underneath, in quote marks, Lydie Barcroft. Now, I just want to read to you what actually got her sentenced and sent to the death camps. She volunteered for voluntary castration in the hope that it would save her from that fate. But a health counsellor, in his report, wrote this about her. He is fundamentally a transvestite. His behavior is accordingly feminine and infantile. His voice is unicoidal. It is impossible to make him understand the immorality of his actions. His criminal habitus is a pathological fixation. He is and will remain a corrupter of morals of the worst kind, and thus must be eliminated from the Volksgemeinschaft. That's the Nazi concept of the national community or peoples. Now, that report in 1938 ensured that Libby was first sent to the penal system, and then when she finished her sentence in November 1942, she was then transferred to the death camps, and on the 8th of January 1943 was murdered in Mauthausen, I think it is, concentration camp. Now, she wrote personal stories where she would very quickly easily is identifiable as exploring her gender identity and her sexuality. And she's very, very rare in that. And it's really difficult to identify these people. But I want to finish, because my time's up now, with a quote from the 75th anniversary of Holocaust Memorial Day. And it's from Marian Tursky. And he said, quote, do not be indifferent when you hear lies, when any minority is discriminated against, because the essence of democracy is that the majority governs. But democracy hinges on the rights of minorities being protected at the same time. Do not be indifferent when any power or government infringes on the social compacts that are the basis of this. And that's what we need to guard against. If you belong to a majority, the essence of a democracy is safeguarding the rights of minorities. I'll leave it there.
Saoirse, for that. And I know it's difficult stepping in last minute, but powerful testimony. And actually, if you read the history, it's clear that that discrimination and whitewashing of the killing of the LGBT plus community continued after the war, when the Allied governments refused to remove paragraph 175, which is Nazi inspired, and they wouldn't recognize the prisoners who were from the LGBT plus community as victims of the Nazis. And so that's why it's so important that we remember that as well. I know you're going to stay with us for about 8-9 minutes as well. And Smajo is here as well, just to take some questions that have come through and just some comments that I just wanted to share. Sarah Answer, who we all know, she's from the Independent Office for Police Conduct, says, I'm very glad the union is holding this Holocaust Memorial Day event and all the other anti-racist events PCS supports. We face increasing anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred from Reform and other far-right groups. Our members must be at the forefront of combating all forms of racism. We must never forget the road to Auschwitz and all the other death camps were paved by the defeat of the organised working class across Europe, and it must never happen again. There was a bit around disabled people, people of colour were victims alongside the LGBT plus Gypsy, Roma, as well as socialist trade unions as well, who were, along with travellers community, who were deliberately targeted. So when people ask why is PCS holding a Holocaust Memorial Day event, because it's a trade union issue for us as part of our history. Okay, can we go through some of the questions, Smajo and Saoirse? Do you want to take the first one, Smajo? Question is, what lessons from your experience during the Holocaust and the Bosnian genocide do you think are most important for younger generations to learn and carry forward? Because you think about the Holocaust survivors who are now sadly a very smaller number now, many of them are passing away. What are the key messages you want to get across about the Bosnian genocide to future younger generations?
Yeah, as you rightly say, a lot of the Holocaust survivors are sadly no longer able to take part or travel the country. I mean, last night I was at the national ceremony. I was sitting between two survivors. One was 92 and the other one was 96, I believe. I've had the honor and privilege of hearing from Holocaust survivors, as I mentioned at the start, and it's changed my understanding of peace and humanity. And I think it's so incredibly important because there's no better way of learning about these things that we're discussing tonight than from the people that have experienced it firsthand. So yeah, survivor testimony and personal testimony is so important. For me, I'm often asked, what can we do to safeguard what we have here in the UK? And for me, the first step is acceptance. It's accepting what happened during the 1940s or 30s and 40s, what happened in the 90s, what's happening in other parts of the world now can happen here. And for me, that's the best way to safeguard what we have here in the UK. It's accepting that it's not something that happens to someone else, somewhere else. It can happen, because that's what we thought in Bosnia. You know, for me, war and violence and bombs were these abstract concepts that I saw in history books on TV. And then we became those people that we saw on TV. And when I go into schools, again, I've had the honor of going into schools with Holocaust survivors. A lot of the kids are shocked because, you know, one of the schools I went into last year with Martin Stern, a lot of the kids expected him to be of his age. And then when they saw me, they were shocked because they didn't think these things happened. So we can't be complacent. We need to be vigilant. And I do this work and I'm traveling up and down the country, and sometimes I don't mean to scare people. I'm not saying we're close or we're on the road to genocide necessarily, but we just can't be complacent, and we have to challenge all forms of hatred, wherever they are and whatever they are. We have to become a society where we challenge these things.
Thank you, Smajo. Saoirse, obviously after the war, not many LGBT plus victims came forward because of the sort of homophobia that you were referring to and bigotry that existed. There are very few known victims still alive. How important is it that we get research to kind of unhide the sort of Nazi-inspired homophobia and bigotry that we saw?
like any persecution, eyewitness testimonies while the people are still alive and can be with us are crucially important to understanding. And the academic research in this field is again absolutely vital, because it's that academic research that's uncovering the names of the victims. You know, like the two lesbians that I referenced in the brief talk I gave. And it's only through the work of academics delving into the records. And we have to remember that a lot of the records were destroyed as the Nazis realized that they were going to lose the war, and were set about destroying the evidence of their war crimes. And so, yeah, the recovery of those first-hand testimonies should be a priority, I think. And yes, people have referenced other communities like the Roma and people with disabilities that were also victims. What's true of the LGBT plus community is true of all the victims of the Holocaust, and especially those that were erased from the statistics, erased from the narrative. We need to reclaim those voices and give them that platform that they truly deserve.
Yeah. I think we've got a couple of minutes. So Majo, there's a bit around distortion of history. I mean, it's your 30th anniversary since the Bosnian genocide, but there are people even now trying to distort the history and the lived experience of what happened to you and your community. How do you counter that? Because they come forward, you know, Croat nationalist, far-right Serb nationalist, who try to distort what actually happened.
It's a very good question, because sadly, what happened in Bosnia when the war ended, the peace agreement that was forced upon the Bosnian government effectively left the country divided. You have 49% of the country, which is a semi-autonomous region called Republika Srpska. There is no official English name for it. But Muslims, Catholics, Jewish people, Roma, they were all ethnically cleansed from that region. Some have returned, but a very small number. And then you have the other part, which is more mixed and diverse. But effectively, what happened, the war and the peace agreement rewarded those people that committed mass atrocities, and the same war criminals, the people that terrorized, that raped, that killed, they're still living in the same communities where they did all these things. The guy that took my dad to the prison camp, to a concentration camp, one of his best friends, he's still there. Years ago, my dad went back to Bosnia and he saw him on the bus. He sat next to my dad and it was like, what are you up to? Like, it was the most normal thing. My cousin, I mentioned some of my cousins were 16 in concentration camps. They were beaten and tortured by their friends, by their neighbors, by people that they knew. On the 9th of January, just a few weeks ago, the Bosnian Serb authorities in Bosnia celebrate the creation of their entity, which is the onset of the Bosnian genocide. So you have that celebration of the Bosnian genocide, of the genocide and murder, murder of 100,000 people, rape of up to 60,000 young girls and women in the heart of Europe, and we don't react to that. One of the biggest massacres committed by the Bosnian Croats was in a village called Ahmići, where 116 Muslim civilians, babies, elderly, were killed. It was actually discovered by the British Army, by members of the Cheshire Regiment. The man who was responsible for carrying out that massacre and coordinating and organizing, called Dario Kordic, he was convicted in The Hague. He was released after serving a third of his sentence, I think. I don't remember exactly. To a hero's welcome in Croatia. Remember, Croatia is in the EU. Hero's welcome. He was recorded last year. There's a video that you can find on social media where he says, I don't regret anything, and I would do it all again. And you can also Google Colonel Bob Stewart speaking about it in the British Parliament, describing how his soldiers found torched, babies, kids. So that's the kind of environment that Bosnians find themselves in. But what's incredible, it's not just my mom that's reacted in this way, and not my grandparents. My grandparents carried their daughter out of the house on a blanket bleeding. But it's not just them that reacted in this way. So many Bosnian mothers in particular that have lost 50, 60 family members, everyone and everything, living in ghost towns. But how they've been able to reject hatred, anger, and extremism is incredible. It's beyond me. But Bosnia finds itself in a very difficult situation because genocide and mass murder and rape is openly celebrated. And again, I'm conscious of time, but I'll give you another example.
Sure.
And you can Google this. If you just Google rape hotel Bosnia, the BBC and the Guardian and various other news media outlets in the UK covered this a few years ago. A hotel which was used for the rape and murder of hundreds of women in Bosnia is now open. You can leave a review on TripAdvisor. You can unknowingly go to Bosnia because Bosnia has become touristy again. It's a beautiful country. And you can end up staying in a place like that where people would be traumatized, because if you look through the court files, you can see in some of the rooms, it's the same tiles. It's even the same furniture items, same bed frame, same chairs that were used in the 90s. So it's incredibly difficult to talk about reconciliation and peace. But what we can learn from Bosnian Muslims is how we react to those things. Because as I said, it's not my mom and my grandparents that reacted like this. It's as a society in Bosnia, we've managed to do that.
Yeah. I know we're running a couple of minutes over, but I just wanted to ask you, Saoirse, around how can we make sure that we tackle hate in today's society so that genocides that we've seen in the past don't happen?
Well, as the lessons from the 1930s show, it's about people standing together. You know, one of the fundamentals of trade unionism, an injury to one is an injury to all, and realizing that just because somebody has a difference from you, that doesn't mean that they therefore need to be persecuted. But it's also about those who are in the majority, and that can be any category of person. Those who are in the majority that are actually doing the persecuting or perpetuating these false images, stand up and say, "Not in my name. No, this isn't right. This group of people are not like that. That you're stereotyping." All the arguments that we know. But it's about showing that solidarity, not being silenced when people attack you for standing up for the group that's being persecuted, but being willing to stand beside that group that's being persecuted and say, "No, this stops here, this stops now." And you know, I'm minded of Oswald Mosley's march to the East End of London that was stopped by the local population and the trade union movement, amongst others, by showing solidarity together. And that's what we need to do, show solidarity against the different forms of rising hate that sow division and hate amongst us.
Thank you so much. I could listen to both of you all night, but sadly we run out of time. So Smajo Besa, who's the survivor of the Bosnian genocide, but also more importantly, you set up the Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we've also got Saoirse Tweedale, who's chair of our very own PCS Proud National Committee. Thank you for stepping in last minute. Thank you, both of you. As I said, if you want to email us your comments or your questions and actually give us some feedback for this very first inaugural national event that we're doing here at PCS Union, because we're doing it because we're an anti-racist trade union organisation, and tackling racism is at the heart of everything that we do as a union. Really proud and privileged to welcome our national president, Martin Kavanagh, to address us now, and then we'll have our final speaker and then open up to questions and comments. Martin, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you, sir. I think you might be on mute, Martin. Yeah. You think after 4 years we would be experts at the mute button?
I know. Yeah. Schoolboy error. Apologies, everyone. Thank you so much, Mohammed. And I want to start off by thanking yourself, but also the National Black Members Committee of PCS for organising this Holocaust Memorial event at such an important time. I mean, yesterday we obviously saw the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and some of the most harrowing and horrendous images that we've witnessed on the news channels last night. But I think also even more important than that was a real day of reflection when people, remembered, quite rightly remembered the atrocities that were unearthed on that day. And throughout this week, I know there's a number of events taking place tonight in addition to this one that's been organised by PCS Black members, because I think it really is absolutely critical as far as our union is concerned that we don't just remember, but we reflect and we recommit ourselves actually to the pledges that both Smayo, Mohammed and Saoirse have just said there, that actually we really do need to recommit ourselves to making sure that the never again is not just a phrase. It is something that we mean. It is something that we campaign towards, and it's something that we absolutely work towards. And I want to really start off by echoing the comments that Mohammed made in his opening remarks at the outset tonight, that we do need to remember, and always should remember, that whether it's the Holocaust or whether it's the other genocides we heard about Bosnia from Smayo earlier on, but obviously we see, and I've seen over the past 40, 50 years, genocides in many areas and many regions of the world. And they do not begin, and they didn't begin, in the industrialized death camps in Auschwitz or elsewhere. Genocide begins with the dehumanization of people, of treating groups of our fellow humans differently. We treat them as others. We see them as less human somehow than ourselves. We see them as people who can be scapegoated and demonized. That is where the Holocaust started. That is where every genocide that we've witnessed has started, by targeting and scapegoating and allowing that to get hold in our society and our communities, which Smayo absolutely powerfully demonstrated in his contribution just a few moments ago. So I'm really proud of the work that PCS does, not just in organising this event tonight, but the ongoing work that we do, because we don't just stand for workers' rights. Yes, obviously that's our bread and butter, that is the core of what we do, but we absolutely also understand that we have to always have and always will stand for equality and stand against discrimination. And I think critically in what tonight shows, that stance isn't just in the workplace, it is also in wider society, but absolutely critically as well, it has to be internationally if we're ever to learn the lessons and make sure that we don't repeat the horrors of the past. During the Holocaust, you've already heard from our brilliant opening speakers, you know, it wasn't just Jews that were targeted. You know, we saw the LGBT plus community targeted. We saw trade unionists and communists and socialists targeted. We saw the Roma communities absolutely decimated. And obviously we know that the Jewish people, not just in Germany, but in countries occupied by Nazi forces, where we saw 6 million Jewish people meet their death for the crime of being Jewish. Now that is something that is not only highly emotive and highly powerful, that is something that should always tell us that we have to do everything we possibly can to ensure that the likes is never witnessed again. And sadly, in the current day and age, I think it's fair to say that we don't and haven't, as a world and a wider society and internationally, learned all those lessons that we should have done. And we absolutely also have to realise that it isn't just the events in a particular nation or in a particular country that is allowing these atrocities to take place. It is also the international response. And Saoirse made reference a few moments ago to the response in Britain. Yes, we saw the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, when it was primarily the local communities and socialists and trade unionists that turned up to stop Mosley and his gang storming through London's East End, an area obviously at the time with a huge Jewish population. But then only just a few years later, as it was becoming clear to the world what the Nazi force was all about, that we saw the British media, or certainly large sections of the British media, still pumping out rhetoric that spewed hatred and spewed division and spoke of, such as the Daily Mail headline, German Jews pouring into this country, describing refugees as aliens and describing them as a problem. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking we've heard that somewhere else recently, and we've heard it quite a lot, including from, sadly, mainstream politicians over the past number of years. And that is why we absolutely have to remember events such as the Holocaust, such as the other genocides that we've seen. Because if we don't learn from those history lessons, if we don't understand the devastation, what happens at a time of Holocaust and genocide, but equally, if we don't understand the circumstances which allow a situation like that to flourish, we will be in danger of repeating the mistakes. And again, Smayo absolutely nailed it in his Q&A response when he said that it doesn't take much imagination to understand that some of the rhetoric we hear in the current day and age is not dissimilar to some of the rhetoric that we would have heard back in the 20s, 30s and 80s, early 90s in the former Yugoslavia. Because this summer, or last summer, we saw far-right thugs seeking to exploit, and it was exploitation, of those terrible, tragic, horrendous murders of 3 young girls in Southport to their own ends to spread hatred and division. And I was really proud, not just of the community response. I'm from Merseyside, as you can probably hear from my accent, but I wasn't just proud of the community response to that, where the far right mobilised in Southport, but I was really proud of the labour and trade union movement response. And our union was amongst those that not only responded straight away, but absolutely stood alongside other trade unions and other campaigning and community activist groups, alongside Stand Up to Racism and other anti-racists, to say that we will not allow your rhetoric to spread. We will not allow your division and hatred to get a foothold in our society and in our communities, because if we do, the horrors that we're hearing about tonight can be repeated, and can be repeated a lot closer to home. Because I think it's trade unionists and it's socialists who have traditionally come together to fight fascists. Yes, along with local communities, the local community has to be key in all of this. But it is us as a united front that have mobilised in this country, and we've seen them off time and time and time again. But we can't rest on our laurels. And indeed, this coming weekend, I will be speaking in central London again at a Stand Up to Racism counter demo, when the far right are mobilising to demand the release of Tommy Robinson. Not because that individual has any degree of importance, because in my view, and our union's view, he doesn't, but because what he stands for and what his supporters on the streets of London next Saturday will stand for is exactly what those who've committed horror and atrocity in the past have stood for. It stands for demonisation. It stands for blaming asylum seekers and refugees. It stands for othering people who they don't quite fit their narrative of what they see as a perfect human being. And absolutely, we have seen, especially last summer, when we saw refugee camps and we saw hotels being set on fire by thugs, regardless of the consequence of what actually could happen with those flames engulfing those buildings with people inside. Regardless of that, if people can do that, if people can commit those acts of crime in this country and on the streets of this country, they would be prepared to do far worse if they were ever in a position of power to be able to do so. So that is why events like tonight is so important. It's why the messaging that Saoirse has given on behalf of our proud National Committee and on behalf of the LGBT plus community is absolutely critical that we hear. It's why Smayo's contribution and our next contribution as well that we're going to hear about the Holocaust is so important. But what I want to really do in closing, Mohammed, is this really. I just want to spend a few moments to repeat the immortal words of Pastor Martin Niemöller. I think a powerful poem that most people on here tonight will know and have heard of. And we all know about the controversy sometimes that is linked to Pastor Niemöller. But the words, first they came from the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. That does two things, I think. That not only sends a powerful message about the dangers that are inherent in allowing ourselves to be divided. But I think it gives an equally powerful message about the importance and the power of solidarity and standing together. And it is something that we should all reflect on and learn from. So really what I would say in closing, Mohammed, is this, that we in the trade union movement know all about solidarity. We understand what it takes, we understand what it means, and we understand the importance of that collective response and that collective power. But I think sometimes we forget that actually also with it comes some responsibility and a degree of responsibility. And so I want to give a real clear message on behalf of our union to everyone out there tonight at this week of reflection and contemplation. Whether it's our current government or a future government, whether it's some far-right group who decide that they want to target and single out ethnic minorities or refugees or disabled people in this country, our union always has and always will stand with you all in solidarity. And I'll leave it there, comrade.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you so much for your leadership and your support for anti-racism campaigns that we always have. You never say no, so thank you very much, my friend, as well. I'm going to move on to our final speaker, who's Julia Burton from the 45 AIDS Society. For those of you who might not know what that is, it was set up as a charitable organisation in 1963, and it was a group of child Holocaust survivors known as the Boys. They were brought to Britain at the end of the Second World War, and this is really important that their story, their experience lives on through generations to come. I've had the distinct honour of working on organising Holocaust Memorial Day for government departments for the last 3 years. So this is the first year we've done it for PCS, and I'm really proud it's fourth such event. I think it's really important that we do that, and really honoured and privileged that Julia Burton from the 45 AIDS Society is here with us to share her story about the Holocaust. Julia, thank you so much for coming tonight. We've had loads of comments, loads of questions, so hopefully we'll get through some of them at the end, but over to you, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say how fantastic the other speakers were. So really had a very big impact on me. I'm ready for my slideshow. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Julia Burton, and I'm the daughter of David Herman. This was me and my father, taken on his 80th birthday in 2006. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he was in 5 concentration camps. He was born in Czechoslovakia in 1926 in a small town called Munkac. Now it's part of the Czechoslovakia is now Czech Republic and Slovakia, but his town of Munkac is now in Ukraine. He came from quite a big family. He had an older brother, a younger sister, and a little brother. That's David. He was the second one. And he actually had a very nice childhood growing up in Munkac. He lived in this lovely house. He had a normal childhood like a lot of people back then. He was quite a rebel. He played in the garden, and he used to climb trees and steal walnuts from his neighbor. He swam in the Latorica River, and he would go to this Art Deco cinema and see Charlie Chaplin films and Laurel Hardy, and had a very nice time with his friends as a young boy. Unfortunately, I don't have any early pictures of him or any of his family, so I just have to imagine what he might have looked like as a young boy. And this is kind of what I think. He was probably quite cheeky. He was from a very religious family, and he would go to regular school and do his Jewish studies as well. And in 1939, he was just 12 when the war broke out, and things started to change in Munkac. Life became very difficult as there were anti-Jewish laws which forbade people from studying at university, becoming doctors or lawyers, and there were violent attacks against Jews as well. And my father was very badly bullied at school. In 1941, in Munkac, the yellow star was introduced, and you had to wear a yellow star on your coat, your jacket, on your arm. It didn't matter how old you were, very young children, babies, elderly people, they had to show that they were Jewish. If you had a Jewish business, you had to put a star in the window. And if you didn't do so, there was severe punishment. Life got very hard for the Jewish community. And until this point, my father and his family had lived in an ethnically mixed part of town, but they didn't feel so safe. So they moved to this small flat in the Jewish part of town, and they thought they'd be safer there. However, they were wrong, because in 1943, this area of town where they lived was sectioned off, and a 2-meter high fence was built around them, and this area was turned into the ghetto of Munkac. And all the Jews of Munkac were forced to go and live in this ghetto. And all of my father's extended family, many aunts and uncles and cousins, all moved into the small flat with him and his family. It was extremely crowded. There wasn't enough food. It was very uncomfortable. The family did hear little bits of news about what was going on in the region, but my father never thought anything could possibly ever happen to him or his family. But he was so wrong, because one night in April 1944, the Nazis ordered all the Jews to leave their homes, and they were given just 30 minutes to pack a bag, and were told that they were being sent to work in farms, to farms in the east. They were told to hand over their valuable possessions, and they were even given receipts to trick them. Of course, they never got anything back. And they were taken to a railway and forced onto these cattle trucks. There was very little air. As you can see, there's just a tiny opening with barbed wire. They were crammed in 100 in a truck. They were given no food. They had no water and just a bucket to relieve themselves. My father and his family were on this train for 4 days and 3 nights. There were children crying, old people collapsed. Some people died on that journey. And eventually they did arrive at their final destination, which was not farms in the east, but it was Auschwitz-Birkenau. And in the chaos of getting off the train, somebody whispered into my father's ear, "Say that you're 18 and that you have a trade." So when there was a selection on the platform, people were asked how old they were, what they did. He said he was 18 and was a carpenter. And he was sent to the line on the right, but his mother and women and children and the elderly and babies were all sent to the line on the left and sent straight to their deaths to the gas chambers. And that was the last time he saw his mother on that platform. And he was separated from his family and alone, and he was locked in a barrack surrounded by electrified fences. And thousands of people died in Auschwitz. And my father told me it was a soul-destroying place, but he was lucky to come out alive, because after a number of weeks, he was put on another transfer to another concentration camp called Buchenwald in Germany, where this photo was taken. And this is the earliest photograph we have of my father. He was just 17. And you may know that the Nazis insisted on documenting everything so well. And this is my father's prisoner registration card from Buchenwald. And it has so much information about him, you know, his name, address, why he was arrested. He was a political Hungarian Jew. He was hardly political. He was just a young boy. The dates that he was arrested, his description, his height, the shape of his face, what his body was like, the color of his hair. They documented everything. After Buchenwald, he was transferred to another camp called Gleina for 6 weeks. And while he was there, he was sent to a slave labor camp. And then he stayed in Remsdorf for 10 months. And he worked at the Brabak factory, which made petroleum products for the Germans. And his job was to build a railway to transport these goods. And he had to dig and clear stone to lay the new railway tracks. He had to carry 50-kilo sacks of cement. And conditions were so bad. There was very little food. They worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week. And with such physically hard work and not many calories, many people died. There was very little sustenance, but somehow my father managed to keep going. And then in late 1944, the Allies were bombing Germany. And because the Brabak factory was an important target because of its contribution to the war effort, the factory got bombed. The Germans and the SS had air raid shelters, but the Jewish prisoners and other prisoners were just left to hide themselves. And during one bombing raid in October 1944, my father was injured when a bomb went off just a few meters away from him, and his leg was badly cut by a piece of shrapnel. He got infected, and he bandaged it up as best he could with scraps of paper from cement bags and bits of string. Another prisoner shielded him from the view of guards, but he was really struggling to walk to and from the hard labor camp. And when they were walking or marching to work every day, the SS would cycle along on their bicycles and make them jog when they could hardly walk, would jeer at them. And my father said that they often walked past German villages, and he just said he felt invisible. People didn't notice these prisoners and how much they were struggling. He just felt invisible. He was almost ready to give up when, at the beginning of February 1945, a miracle happened. He was actually reunited with his little brother, Aby, who had arrived at the same camp, Remsdorf. He had been at Auschwitz all this time, and a Nazi officer had taken a liking to him and used him as a shoeshine boy and let him sleep in a dog kennel and gave him extra food. When my father met his little brother, his spirits were lifted enormously, and he felt he had a purpose again, and that he still found he had some fight left in him. The two brothers looked out for each other and shared what little food they had and were inseparable. By the end of March 1945, the bombing had increased so much the Allies were advancing. The Germans decided to evacuate the camp, and they marched 3,000 prisoners out of the camp and put them onto open carriages of a long freight train. They spent 5 days on this train and were given food only once. My father told me how it was snowing heavily and they would sit there with their mouths open, catching the snow, as that's all they had. Eventually, the train was hit by a US attack and the group of 3,000 prisoners were forced to march. They didn't know where they were going. They marched for 20 days. They slept outside in the cold and wet. They were given nothing to eat at all. Many died, their bodies strewn along the roadside. My father said they were so hungry, they would eat anything. Grass, the buds off trees. They chewed on tree bark. My father said that when he could go no further, his brother encouraged him and dragged him along. And at other times, when his little brother was close to giving up, my father tried to half carry him, and they kept each other alive. Eventually, they crossed the border from Germany into Czechoslovakia, and they arrived at a small town called Chomutov. And for my father, this was a very big turning point, because until now he'd felt invisible, had been treated so badly. But the people in Chomutov came out onto the streets, and they were shocked at the state of these poor prisoners. They shouted at the SS, and they threw fruit and bread and cakes to them. And even though the SS shot in the air, they still came forward. And this was really the first time that my father realized that there were people who cared. And I'd like to share a video of my father talking about this time.
We were on this death march. We started off originally about nearly 3,000, and we ended up about just over 300. The rest died on the way, or were killed or bombed or so. When we reached the Czech border, which was in a town called Chomutov, I suddenly realized that there is a world beyond. The people suddenly came out, the whole town came out, and they were showering us with fruit and bread and so on. The SS was threatening to shoot them. They fired in the air, but they wouldn't. They still came out and did it. And, well, we had tears in our eyes. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that there were people who cared.
And so, after 5 days of traveling by train and 20 days of marching, out of the 3,000 prisoners, only 319 survived, and my father was one of them. They arrived at Theresienstadt, a former ghetto-turned-camp. The Russian army was now getting close, and the SS had run away, and the camp was being run by Czech Jews. My father was seriously ill with dysentery and typhus and severe dehydration. He weighed just 28 kilos, which is about 4 stone. You could count every bone in his body. He had no hair, no eyelashes, no eyebrows. When he ate anything, because he was so emaciated, you could see the food passing down into his stomach. He was put in a hospital room and slept for 3 days. And when he awoke, it was the 9th of May, 1945, and the camp had been liberated, and he could hear people celebrating. He was transferred to a Russian hospital, and he recuperated there for a while. And when he felt a little bit stronger, he and his little brother traveled to Prague, and they went to the offices of the Jewish community, who took them to an orphanage for child camp survivors. And people were very kind to him there, and they looked after him well. And he started looking for his family through the Red Cross, and he was amazed when he found his sister, who had been rescued from Bergen-Belsen, and his older brother, who was now in a DP camp. But sadly, his mother, father, aunts and uncles, about 54 of his family members were murdered. At the beginning of 1946, my father heard about an opportunity to travel to the UK by the Prague Jewish community. The British government agreed to allow 1,000 orphan child camp survivors to come to the UK, paid for by the Jewish community known as the CBF. Today that is World Jewish Relief. Sadly, they could only find 732. Only 80 were girls, and so they became known as the boys. My father came to England with a group of children in 1946. He was in the second group. The first group are a famous group known as the Windermere Children, and there's a very good program about that you may have seen. My father was sent to Lancashire to a place called Montford Hall, where he spent 10 weeks in rehabilitation and learning English. This map shows you his journey. He started in Munkach, went to Auschwitz, then to Buchenwald, then to Gleina, then to Remsdorf, then to Theresienstadt, then to Prague, and then to England. When he was in England, he was reunited with his sister who visited and his younger brother. The older brother had met a girl in the DP camp and married her and gone to live in America where her family were. In England, he became close friends with so many other child survivors. They became his new family. They became extremely close. They were all each other had. This group, known as the Boys, about half of them settled permanently in England. The rest moved to America, Israel, and Canada. But they stayed in touch their whole lives. My father met my mother through work, and they got married in 1954. They set up their own business. Turned out my father was a very talented, creative person. He became a designer and he worked in the fur business. And they had a new Herman family. They had 4 children of their own. And family was incredibly important to my father, having lost most of his. And his grandchildren were the apples of his eye. And the Boys set up a charity in 1963 called the 45 Aid Society. And they did this in order to look after each other and to give back to society. This was a very big part of my father's life, the Boys, and they particularly wanted to raise money for World Jewish Relief, who were the very charity who brought them over in the first place. They also raised money for other refugees, most recently refugees from Syria and Afghanistan. In the year 2000, my father met the Queen at the opening of the Holocaust exhibition at the Imperial War Museum. And in 1999, my father and his family, we all went to Auschwitz for the first time. It was a very difficult trip to make because this had been the last place that my father saw his parents. But coming back with all his family was his act of defiance. David, my father, returned again in 2005 for the 60th anniversary of the liberation of the camps. He and other survivors were invited there with many dignitaries to attend a special ceremony, and the press and the TV were there, and it was the first time that he told his story to the world and was interviewed by the BBC and was in the newspapers. And it was really only then that he started talking about his experiences. In 2008, my sister and our families went back to Munkach, and we found his house. We found the very tree that he climbed as a boy. We found the river he swam in, and the same cinema that he'd gone to see all those old movies. And it was an important trip to make. It was very uplifting for me because for the first time we realized that he had had a lovely life before the war, and they hadn't come just from a black hole that was Auschwitz. And Munkach was a beautiful place. My father eventually got a computer in 1990, and he taught himself to use it and write his story. All his life, he remained interested in anything to do with the Holocaust. This photo was taken at his 82nd birthday with his children and grandchildren, and his brother Abi's children and grandchildren. It was taken just a few months before he died. He died in 2008, but with his book unfinished. But my sister and I published it several years later in 2017, and it's called David's Story, and it's available on Amazon. And finally, my father was interviewed on several occasions and asked about the terrible times he had endured. And after all that he went through, he wasn't bitter. He didn't have hatred. And this is something that he said that has always stuck with me. Cue the soundtrack.
Happy times. I was at very happy times in life and very sad times in my life. But I prefer to think of the happy times.
Thank you very much for listening. That's my father's story.
Thank you so much, Julia. Powerful testimony, really. Yeah, thank you. I know Martin's here as well. So, Martin, is there anything you want to say to Julia before we move on to the questions?
Just absolutely incredible, Julia. So powerful, and to actually hear that sort of first-hand account of what your father went through, but actually the suffering, but also as well the clear dignity with which he held himself, even in later years, is a credit to him and all your family. So that was so powerful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Julie, can we start with you? So there's a bit around, I asked Marjo and Saoirse about this, about the distortion of history, where people are trying to minimize what happened in the Holocaust or minimize the numbers. There's debates around the numbers, or did they actually happen or didn't happen? I mean, which is deeply offensive to obviously yourself and the survivors of the victims. But what can we do in today's society to make sure that, one, that we don't ever forget, but also more importantly, that we kind of challenge the fake news and the sort of hatred out there?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that the testimony gets shared. And I would say that now you've heard it, you are a witness to my father's testimony. And I hope you'll carry that and spread the word. And of course, fortunately, there is so much documentation, and many survivors have given their stories, and even the Nazis recorded it. So it is undeniable, but it doesn't mean to say that there aren't people out there who will do whatever they can to lessen it and rubbish the numbers in all of that.
Yeah, so true. Martin, so the question that's come through is, how can PCS members ensure that the lessons of past genocides are integrated into workplace equality and diversity initiatives?
Yeah, cheers, Mohammed. I mean, very simply, Julia's just hit the nail on the head, that when you hear sort of first-hand accounting of these experiences, then it's incumbent on all of us to actually not only reflect on that, but actually to make sure that we repeat the messages we hear. We can't, and I could never do it anywhere near as powerfully as Julia has just done it, because obviously I and my family haven't lived through that experience, but the truth is the truth. And what we have found, certainly in PCS, Mohammed, as you know, is that we've deliberately invented and devised and created the ARA strategy, against racism, against fascism strategy. And the whole point of that is about educating. It's actually not just about mobilizing. It's not just about trying to arm our members in the workplace and in their personal lives with the arguments against sort of the far right rhetoric or against fascism and fascist rhetoric, but actually educating people as to not only the truth about what we can learn from the past, but how easy it is for the narrative to slip back to the same sort of narrative that we would have seen back in the 1920s, 1930s. And once that gets hold, and once that becomes the norm and an accepted norm, that's when you start seeing, repeats of past history. And that's really what I think we can do, Mohammed, is keep that education going. I'm really proud of the work that we do to try and build on our strategy to make sure that we get our message across. But it's something that, and I think this is the commitment that we all share. We don't just launch something and then give it a good go for a few weeks or a few months and then forget about it and put it on the shelf. This is an ongoing need to keep making sure that we educate and we get these messages out, because it is, if we can't learn lessons from the inhumanity of which past generations have inflicted on others, we will never learn anything.
And I think it starts with education in schools. I mean, the 45A Society sends survivors and second generation, even third generation, are telling their grandparents' story and telling children, this is what happens if prejudice and hatred are allowed to fester. This is where it can lead, basically. And that we are all the same.
Yeah, definitely. Julia, this thing around what sort of parallels are there? I mean, obviously, you're from your lived experience, but between the events that led up to the Holocaust, because it didn't happen in a vacuum, did it?
No, it started on this, kind of started in the street. And really, quite simply, it's all about timing and what's going on in the world and looking for scapegoats. And there's an element of that repeating itself a bit, I think, today. And
is that with the sort of rise of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia?
Yeah. It is pretty bad, actually.
And do you think, sorry, Martin, do you think that education can help us tackle the rising anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and bigotry and racism in the workplace?
I think it's absolutely key, Mohammed, because if you don't educate people as to why we need to show a more human and a more, a more respectful and inclusive, and why we need to have a more respectful and inclusive society, the danger is that the powerful, and let's face it, the powerful messages that quite often come from on high, especially at times of difficulty. So if people are struggling financially, if people are struggling economically, if we know that people are going through hardship, sadly, if people then start being targeted or the media start picking on certain groups, whether it's the Muslim community, whether it's LGBT plus community, whether it's the Jewish community, whatever it is, that gets a hold and people always look for someone else to blame. And I think what we have got to try and do, and continue to do, we do it, and the movement does it, but we've got to continue to do it, is actually keep that sort of the flag flying. This is not actually about any group of humans. This is not actually about any particular person or type of person. This is about a circumstance. It's quite often about a political choice that is being made to start with, or an economic choice that's being made to start with. And so absolutely, our ability to continue to educate, but actually not just educate, because I think there's a danger that sometimes you can come across as, well, you're almost instructing people to think a certain way. It's not about that. It's about trying to educate people so they can understand and bring their own understanding to the reality that they face compared to what others and past generations have faced. We know we can do that because history shows us that when we collectivize together, can get it right. It's just that we have these terribly dark and evil, and they are evil, episodes in history when there was such a powerful force the opposite direction. And our task is to make sure we never ever see that again. And I mean never ever see that again. Doesn't matter where it is.
Julia, I'm going to give the last question to you before we wrap up. And that was around, I suppose the survivors that I've spoken to were very reluctant to tell their story. Was that the same with Dad? With your dad, was he reluctant?
At the beginning, when they came over, they were reluctant because nobody could believe how horrific their experience had been. And they just kept it to themselves and were very quiet. It's only very much later in life, sort of late 60s, 70s, 80s, that they started to come out with it much more. And I think by then, they felt they had to tell the story. I mean, I didn't actually know very much about it till I was about 18, which is quite late. There's always a kind of a bit of an elephant in the room, and you know that there's something, but you don't know all the detail. And it's very hard for a parent, I suppose, to share those kind of horrors with their family, their children. But, I did feel different. It's like, how come I had no grandparents? And, not everybody's grandparents are murdered.
Powerful. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Julia. Really powerful testimony. I know sometimes it's really difficult as well to have to relive this again and again and again. But if you don't relive it, then we're not able to be participants as passengers on this journey to kind of educate others as well. But thank you so much to you and all that you do in the 45 Age Society.
Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, is there anything you want to say in conclusion before we wrap up?
Only, again, Mohammed, thank you for all of our speakers tonight, Smayo, Saoirse and Julia. Absolutely, we've certainly had 3 brilliant contributions, but the power of the contributions, I think, is what really hits home to me. And just a message to all the PCS members out there: if you haven't heard of or you don't know what the ARAF strategy is, please go on the PCS website. It's against racism, against fascism, and it is not about conflict. It is not about just demonstrations. It is about learning and learning lessons that we all should always need to learn and want to learn, so we don't repeat the horrors of the past. So thank you very much, and thank you, Mohammed, for yourself and the Black Members Committee for organising this event tonight. It's been I can't say it's been brilliant, because it's not a brilliant thing, but it's so important, and you should be very proud of yourself. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Martin and Julia. I just wanted to finish to say thank you to all the team behind the scenes, Ramona as well, and Law, and everybody in the Equality Department, and also my Vice Chair, Tracy Hilton, who's been working behind the scenes to support this activity. If you've taken anything away from this, and if there's one bit of the story of the survivors or the children of survivors that you've taken away, pass it on to your partner tonight, or to your children, or when you go to do the school run, or you go to work. This link will be on our PCS Union Facebook page, YouTube, and on X, Twitter. Share it amongst your friends, because amongst the rhetoric, amongst the misinformation and the lies and distortions of history, are real stories of real people, and we heard that tonight. I'm really truly inspired by those stories, and I'm really proud to be a member of PCS that puts anti-racism at the heart of everything that they do, that we do, should I say. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us tonight. Have a safe evening. For this Holocaust Memorial Day, we'll see you, God willing, at the next one in 2026. Thank you and good night.